Now we'll move on to look at the muscles of the hand. We'll begin by looking at the extrinsic muscles, the long muscles of the hand which lie in the forearm. Then we'll move on to look at the intrinsic muscles, the short muscles that lie in the hand. Starting with the extrinsic muscles then, we'll look first at the flexors of the fingers, then at the extensors of the fingers, and lastly we'll look at the four long muscles of the thumb. Flexion of the fingers is produced by two long muscles, flexor digitorum profundus and flexor digitorum superficialis. Here's the deep finger flexor, flexor digitorum profundus. It arises from the anterior and medial surface of the ulna and from the interosseous membrane. Here are its four tendons, entering the carpal tunnel. We'll follow them in a minute. This adjoining muscle we'll see later on. It's flexor pollicis longus, the long thumb flexor. Now let's add the superficial finger flexor, flexor digitorum superficialis, to the picture. Here it is. It lies right on top of the profundus. It has two heads of origin, a radial head and a humero-ulnar head. The humero-ulnar head arises as part of the common flexor tendon from the medial epicondyle of the humerus and also from the adjoining ulna. Its radial head arises from this long oblique line on the radius. Between the two heads there's a gap which the median nerve and the ulnar artery both pass through. The four separate tendons of flexor digitorum superficialis are bundled together as they enter the carpal tunnel. Before we follow the superficialis and profundus tendons into the hand, we'll bring the forearm to the upright position. As the flexor tendons pass through the carpal tunnel, they're all enfolded within this common synovial sheath, which extends into the palm of the hand. Just as the flexor tendons emerge from the carpal tunnel, the four profundus tendons give rise to these four intrinsic muscles, the lumbricals. We'll be looking at these later. For now, we'll remove them to simplify the picture. Just before reaching the MP joint, the superficialis and profundus tendons of each finger enter the flexor tendon sheath together. To follow them, we'll remove the sheath. Over the proximal phalanx, the superficialis tendon splits into two halves, which pass around the profundus tendon. We'll remove the profundus tendon for a moment. The two halves of the superficialis tendon reunite, and as they do so, they insert here, on the middle phalanx. The profundus tendon, here it is back in place, emerges between the two halves of superficialis and continues distally to insert here, on the base of the distal phalanx. The action of flexor digitorum superficialis is to flex the proximal IP joint and the MP joint. The action of flexor digitorum profundus is to flex both the IP joints and the MP joint. Now let's look at the muscles that extend the fingers. There are three, a large one that extends all four fingers and two small ones for the index and little fingers. The large one is extensor digitorum, sometimes called extensor digitorum communis. It arises from the common extensor tendon and thereby from the lateral epicondyle. As it passes distally, it divides into four slips, which pass together under the extensor retinaculum. We'll follow them beyond there in a minute. The extensor muscle to the little finger, extensor digiti minimi, arises from the ulnar side of extensor digitorum and passes under the retinaculum by itself. The extensor muscle to the index finger, extensor indicis, lies deep to extensor digitorum. It arises from the ulna and the interosseous membrane. Its tendon passes under the retinaculum along with extensor digitorum. Emerging from beneath the extensor retinaculum, the extensor tendons fan out. As they approach the MP joints, they branch and rejoin in an irregular fashion. Extensor indicis and extensor digiti minimi join the respective extensor digitorum tendons as they reach the MP joint. Here at the MP joint, each extensor tendon gives rise to the extensor hood, then divides into three parts, as we saw when we looked at the extensor mechanism a little while back. The extensor muscles produce extension at all three joints of the finger. Their main effect is at the MP joint. As we'll see later, the interosseous muscles and the lumbricals also have major roles in extending the interphalangeal joints. Now let's move on to look at the long muscles of the thumb. The thumb has a long flexor, a long abductor, and two extensors, a long one and a short one. The long flexor, flexor pollicis longus, lies deep in the forearm. We'll remove flexor digitorum superficialis to see it. Here's flexor pollicis longus, lying alongside flexor digitorum profundus. It arises from the anterior surface of the radius and from the interosseous membrane. Its tendon passes through the carpal tunnel with the finger flexors. Here's the tendon of flexor pollicis longus emerging. It enters the fibrous flexor sheath of the thumb and inserts on the base of the distal phalanx. Flexor pollicis longus flexes both the MP joint and the IP joint of the thumb. The other three long thumb muscles lie on the extensor aspect of the forearm. They lie deep to extensor digitorum, which we'll remove. This is the long abductor, abductor pollicis longus, and these are the extensors, extensor pollicis brevis and longus. The abductor arises from the radius here and also from the interosseous membrane. The two extensors arise a little more distally, the short one here, the long one here. Now we'll put extensor digitorum back in the picture. Here it is. The three thumb muscles emerge obliquely from